To that speech, Jonathan Capehart, that you're writing about by Democratic frontrunner Joe Biden, who lit into the president at a campaign event in Iowa yesterday, accusing the president of fanning the flames of white supremacy and aligning with the nation's darkest forces.
It's both clear language and in code. This president has fanned the flames of white supremacy in this nation. His low energy, vacant-eyed mouthing of the words written for him, condemning white supremacists this week, I don't believe fooled anyone at home or abroad. Trump readily, eagerly attacks Islamic terrorism, but can barely bring himself to use the words white supremacy. And even when he says it, he doesn't appear to believe it. He seems more concerned about losing their votes than beating back this hateful ideology. He says guns are not the problem in mass shootings. The issue is mental health. It's a dodge. Hatred isn't a mental health issue. Trump offers no moral leadership. Seems to have no interest in unifying this nation. No evidence that the presidency has awakened his conscience in the least. Indeed, we have a president with a toxic tongue who has publicly and unapologetically embraced the political strategy of hate, racism, and division. We're living through a rare moment in this nation's history where our president isn't up to the moment, where our president lacks the moral authority to lead, where our president has more in common with George Wallace than he does with George Washington. What this president doesn't understand is that, like every other nation on earth, we're unable to define what constitutes American by religion, by ethnicity, or by tribe. You can't do it. America's an idea. An idea stronger than any army, bigger than any ocean, more powerful than any dictator or tyrant. It gives hope to the most desperate people on earth. Phrases like fake news, enemy of the people, they're no joke. They're insidious. They're corrosive. Trump is trying to weaken our institutions, the press, the courts, the Congress, precisely because they are the only checks on his power. That's what this is all about. The abuse of power. If there's one thing I can't stand, and I know you can't, is the abuse of power. Whether it's a boss taking advantage of his or her workers, or a man who raises his hand to a woman or a child, or a president who's running roughshod over everything this country believes and stands for. On January 20th, 2017, in his inaugural address, Donald Trump painted a dark, bleak picture of our country in crisis when he declared, and I quote, "This American carnage stops right here. It stops right now." But as a sitting president, Trump's anger, hate, and divisiveness, pitting Americans against one another, preying on our divisions, and doing nothing about the endemic and the epidemic of guns is fueling a literal carnage in America. We can't, and I will not, let this man be reelected President of the United States of America. His incompetence, his immorality, his carnage stops with us right here, right now, starting in the Midwest. Limited to 4 years, I believe, and I really do believe this, that history will look back on this presidency as an aberrant moment in American history. But if Donald Trump is reelected, I believe he will forever and fundamentally alter the character of this nation.
That's Joe Biden in Iowa yesterday. President Trump was watching Biden's speech as he was traveling from Dayton to El Paso to comfort that community. The president responded to Biden in a tweet, writing, Watching a sleepy Joe Biden making a speech, so boring. The lamestream media will die in the ratings and clicks with this guy. It will be over for them, not to mention the fact that our country will do poorly with him. It will be one big crash, but at least China will be happy, writes the president. The former vice president's response to that was succinct.
Do you want to respond to the president responding to you?
He should get a life.
He should get a life, says Joe Biden. Biden's communications director responded to the president's tweet, quote, "Glad you're watching. He's talking to you." Jonathan Capehart, your latest piece in the Washington Post titled "Joe Biden reminded all of us what a presidential president would sound like." You write this: "His words were stirring," you say of Joe Biden. "His delivery was passionate, and they were befitting a man who kicked off his campaign with a video decrying Trump's shameful response to Charlottesville. All of the candidates have a moral core and fundamental senses of decency and empathy that Trump never possessed." Yet, unlike teleprompter Trump's hollow remarks about the carnage in El Paso and Dayton, Ohio, Biden came at his speech in Iowa with an authority that is hard to match, his voice providing comfort for those of us who long for the days when a grown-up was president of the United States, acted accordingly, and wielded the bully pulpit of the Oval Office with moral authority. Instead, in Trump, we have a bully with a pulpit and no moral compass. Jonathan Capehart, Joe Biden has always excelled in these moments of grieving, whether it's personal grieving or national grieving, and he did it again yesterday.
Yeah, the speech in its totality, and I'm glad that you showed extensive clips from that speech, but you can slice the speech in half. The first half being hard remarks against President Trump about what he is, who he is, how he's sullied the office, how he has no moral compass and ceded the moral authority of the Oval Office. The other half of the speech was about who we are as a nation, who we are as a people. You played one part of that, which I thought was the most powerful part, where he talks about how America is an idea, and how no matter who you are, no matter who you are, where you came from, whether you were native to this land, brought to this land in chains, or immigrated to this country like his family did from Ireland, no other country in the world can you come to and be American, be a part of this grand experiment. And so while he was lacing into President Trump, he was also reminding us of who we are as a nation. And that's what presidents do. You know, presidents are usually a reflection of our better selves, who we aspire to be. That's why we hold them to higher standards. We want to be like them. At least we used to want to be like them, because they're a reflection of our better selves. But instead, what we have in this president is someone who refuses to not take the bait. Mm-hmm. The question that he got there in El Paso about his reaction to criticisms and things, presidents before him would let that roll right off their backs, would just say, you know what, this is not the time. I am here to grieve with this community. I am here to heal, or actually not take the question at all. And what we have in President Trump is someone who refuses to do that. And the idea that he would spend his time on Air Force One with all the problems in the country and the world that he could be focusing on, to spend his time watching television and tweeting back at opponents and adversaries is quite actually beyond astounding. And one last point. You know, every time I hear someone from the Trump administration pushing back against the media, pushing back against critics, in the old days, administration officials putting out statements were usually talking to the American people. But in those tweets and those comments that we've heard from Scavino and from Grisham, even in those comments, I can't help but think they're not talking to us. They're not talking to the American people. They are talking to President Trump. Those words that are coming out of their mouths in tweets and in statements to the press are words that sound to me like trigger words for the president, so that when he sees them, he can say that, oh, they're standing up and defending me. That's why I think Vice President Biden's speech yesterday was so powerful, because he rose above all this to bring back, or at least try to bring back, some dignity to the American idea, the American experiment, the idea of the presidency. And, you know, I also want to point out, Vice President Biden isn't the only one who is doing this. You talked about Senator Cory Booker in his speech at Mother Emanuel in Charleston, and Beto O'Rourke. Any Democratic candidate stands far taller than the President of the United States in this moment.
They were both powerful yesterday. We're going to hear from both of them in just a moment. John Meacham, it does strike me that in this presidential campaign that we find ourselves in the middle of right now, there's sort of the intellectual policy side of it, which is health care and immigration and foreign policy, and then there's the gut of this, which I think is what Joe Biden was getting to yesterday, which is, America, you're all watching this. You want 4 more years of this? How do you feel right now? You want to continue to feel this way? His message is we've got to put an end to what's happening in this country right now.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things we saw yesterday, isn't it, which goes to your point, is Biden was who you would be at the front door or on the front porch. And Trump is who you are in your den when the door is shut and you're watching Fox. Right? I mean, there's a certain kind of almost respectability argument here. And that's not to lionize the Democrats needlessly, but or pointlessly. But there is a stark contrast that we will see for the next, 16 months, whatever it is, until the election. And I don't know, and you don't know what the result of that is ultimately. But remember, presidential elections are not just simply referenda on someone. They're choices, right? The country wasn't presented a choice in 2016, do you want Donald Trump to be president? It was, do you want Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton? And in the bizarre nature of that moment, we had the result we had. So that's one of the reasons yesterday was so fascinating, was to see who will be on the other side of that choice. And my own sense is that it will only get worse before it gets better with the president. There is, I mean, maybe Jonathan, either of the Jonathans may have a better sense of this. I don't think there's any evidence, and I'm honestly asking this, is there any evidence over the last 4 years or so, 4 years and a month since he announced, of his not acting only in accordance with his own political self-interest? I guess there was one State of the Union, maybe, right, one State of the Union where he was fairly sort of conventional. But there's not going to be, there's no impetus for him to try to reach out. This is going to be a base strategy. It's going to get uglier and uglier. And I think that's why the ethos that Senator Booker and Congressman O'Rourke and the Vice President yesterday created is so important.
We're going to talk to both Jonathans in just a moment. We do have to take a commercial break, but remember the takeaway from the White House yesterday, Dan Scavino, I'll read it again, as the president visited the hospitals where people were lying in the wake of these 2 massacres, was that, quote, the president was treated like a rock star inside the hospital.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.